Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Detonation. Today we have Mr. Gennady. He's the leader of the Transhumanist Party of the United States. I'll just let you briefly introduce yourself. I'm a huge fan. I've been a huge fan for a long time. You're an author. You wrote Death is Wrong. It's a children's book.
Here it is.
Yes. I actually have a copy of that.
On indefinite life extension. And this book has been spread to over 1,000 children worldwide during a fundraiser that I conducted in 2014. And now it's available in 5 languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Russian. And one can even download free PDF versions of it online. So this book is really intended to teach the next generation about the value of pursuing life extension, hopefully inspire a lot of kids to be scientists, philosophers, technologists, advocates for a better future.
We're going to leave that link in the description. I actually have a copy of that book. I enjoyed the book. I'm going to pass it on to my niece and nephews because I think it's something that should get out to more people and that it's encouraging. I will talk to you about some of these population negatives, when people are talking about, the overpopulation factors and how that could be a negative and how you overcome some of those arguments. So we'll go into that. But just briefly explain who you are, very briefly, and we'll get into some of the news elements.
Fundamentally, I am an individual who wishes to use ideas in order to change the world. And I consider myself quite versatile in my skill set. I follow the ideal of the Renaissance man, in that I'm involved both in the philosophical and intellectual aspects of improving the human condition, as well as the practical aspects in terms of organization, administration, and advocacy. I'm an actuary by profession, but in terms of what I would say is my calling, that would be the advocacy of humankind achieving the next great era of our civilization. So this is the advocacy of transhumanism, of futurism, of the acceleration of technological progress. And I do that in a variety of ways. I'm a writer. I create art and musical compositions based on rational premises, and I am the chairman since November 2016 of the United States Transhumanist Party, which aims to implement policies that help us transition to the next era.
And it's a really big honor to me having you on the show because I remember when I was going through the Mises website, I was listening to Mises podcasts, and I was like, I recognize that voice. How come I recognize that voice? And then I realized it was you reading some of the books. So you come from the Austrian School of Economics as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. I studied Austrian economics extensively in college. I've written a peer-reviewed paper for the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. I've contributed articles to both the Mises Institute and FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. I've attended their conferences, and one of my 3 degrees is in economics. So I am most certainly an admirer of the thinking of Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and other thinkers of the Austrian school, such as Hans Hermann Hoppe, Murray Rothbard, Thomas Woods, Robert Murphy, who incidentally was one of my professors, my first economics professor in college. And all of these thinkers are remarkable in that they take a principles-based approach to economics. As anyone who has read anything about Austrian economics knows, Austrian economics differs from the mainstream in that it seeks to understand the basic principles of human action, essentially the forms of human action and how they reflect on the outcomes in economic systems, but more broadly in societal systems. So this science of praxeology, the term that Ludwig von Mises coined, is based on the logical implications of the action axiom. And thinking through those logical implications is very helpful because the world is a messy place. There are a lot of parameters involved in any real-world situation. And as a result, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to make precise quantitative predictions about the future. Essentially, any quantitative prediction relies on some sort of implicit or explicit assumption that the future is going to be very much like the past in certain respects. But there are so many variables, and some of those variables may shift in a way that causes that assumption to be mistaken. But the value that Austrian economics brings is that it enables one to understand the impact of a single decision within this complex system. So Mises would say, I can't predict if the minimum wage is increased, what the unemployment rate is going to be next year. I can't even necessarily predict that the unemployment rate is going to increase because there could be other factors besides the change in the minimum wage that would affect the unemployment rate. But what I can say is that if the minimum wage is increased, all other things being equal, the unemployment rate would be higher than it would have otherwise been because of economic logic and essentially how the principles of human action would be reflected in the responses of economic actors to that decision to increase the minimum wage. So this is a powerful tool because it enables one to look at a complex situation where perhaps 12 different aspects may have changed recently and be able to say, well, this aspect may be responsible for the outcome that we're seeing, but this other aspect should have a directionally contrary effect. So that can't be what's driving the change. Something else must be driving the change. So at the very least, we narrow down our focus and our understanding of economic events. I will say, though, economics will not make one a millionaire necessarily. Economic insight is good for understanding what is happening in the world, but once again, one cannot really, let's say, predict the movement of stock prices just by studying praxeology or any school of economics for that matter.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So since Mises, there was a stock market, but now there's financialization has made a whole bunch of new markets which determine price, like the options market, for example, or these other markets that help determine the price. And it throws some of the rationalism out the window, but also in itself is rational. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So you've used this mechanism and you've paid off your mortgage. Is that right? You've got that out of the way.
Correct. Yes. So the way this happened was interesting in that, armed with the insights of Austrian economics, I realized that I can't really optimize for a particular set of economic conditions. That is to say, I'm not going to have perfect foresight into seeing what is definitively going to happen, but I could pursue a strategy that would give me quite a good outcome in multiple scenarios. And back in 2009, I was extremely concerned about the prospect of hyperinflation, as were a lot of Austrian economists, because of the policy of quantitative easing pursued by the Federal Reserve, and other central banks throughout the world also pursued inflationary monetary policy in a misguided response to the Great Recession. Now, the mistake that a lot of Austrian economists made was essentially an error of knowledge. They didn't foresee that various commercial banks would just be sitting on the excess reserves that were lent out to them by the central banks at very low interest rates. And I was thinking hyperinflation was imminent, so I had better immunize myself against it by purchasing real property. On the other hand, I was thinking, well, if I have this real property and hyperinflation doesn't happen, my best recourse would be still to pay off the mortgage as quickly as possible, because then I avoid the downside of the other scenario, which would be very little inflation, but I have to pay a lot of interest if I make this mortgage last a long time. So my strategy was try to immunize myself against the downsides of both scenarios. I actually personally experienced, when I purchased my house in 2010, the reluctance of the banks, or a major bank, to actually lend money to virtually anybody, even people with excellent credit histories at the time. So there was a backlash to the loose lending standards of the middle of the first decade of the 21st century to a very draconian system where, for someone like me, it was impossible to get any sort of conventional mortgage loan. And this was simply because the bank didn't want to take a chance on a young person without a large number of credit accounts, although the management of those accounts had been excellent. And so I ultimately had to get a mortgage backed by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And as a result of that process, I learned a lot about the bureaucracy internal to these large banks. And this bureaucracy entails a severe lack of communication among the departments of the banks. There was a situation where the same arithmetical error was made on 5 distinct occasions in my application. The arithmetical error was made because the officers at that bank couldn't fathom that somebody would pay the required PMI, or private mortgage insurance, outright at the onset of the loan instead of choosing to finance it into the loan amount. So they tried to essentially double count the PMI. And what's more, I had a 20% down payment on that mortgage. And when there is a 20% or greater down payment, federal laws prohibit the banks from requiring PMI. Nonetheless, this bank went ahead and required the PMI, and about 2.5 years later, I received a letter in the mail from them saying, well, we're under investigation by the FHA, and it turns out we shouldn't have required you to pay this PMI amount, so here's a check for the PMI amount that you paid, plus interest at about a 3% annual rate, which is greater than anyone could have gotten at that time with money in a savings account. So if you cash this check, please be aware you're releasing us from all liability. So I did end up depositing this check and using all of the proceeds of the check to prepay more of the principal of my mortgage. And as a result, that helped accelerate the payoff. Ultimately, I ended up paying off the 15-year mortgage in 6.5 years, and I did choose the 15-year option as opposed to the 30-year option for a reason, because a greater fraction of every payment consists of principal, and the more principal you pay earlier, the less interest you incur over the total life of the loan. When I was a high school student, I recall being aghast at essentially our business teacher telling us that, well, most people in the United States pay in total for a house about 2 to 3 times the selling price of the house because of the interest on their mortgages. And I was determined to avoid that outcome. So ultimately, I ended up paying about 16.5% of the purchase price of the house in interest because I was aggressively prepaying the mortgage, essentially any spare money that I had, apart from a fairly light savings cushion, I was putting into the prepayment of principal. And again, a good piece of advice is prepay as much as possible earlier on in the life of the loan, because then all of your subsequent payments are going to have a much greater proportion of principal. So even if you don't prepay as much afterward, you're still going to be getting rid of that balance on your loan at an accelerated rate.
Yeah, it sounds very Wells Fargo-ian. I don't know. I know you won't mention the name of the bank, but I'm just going to guess it was Wells Fargo. I'm not sure about that.
Wells Fargo.
How did I guess that? I'm not even American. I know these banks way too well. So, yeah, that's fantastic. Anyway, look, do you think, like, this whole Keynesian idea, do you think central banks are now backed into a corner? Because in Australia especially, for example, we should have been raising rates in 2013, 2014. The economy was banging along. Everything was going good. But, I mean, because of American policy, obviously, but they decided not to raise the rates. And in America, the same thing. They haven't raised the rates, and now they have nowhere to go, and now the only place they can go is lower. Do you think the central banks have been backed into a corner on the economy? Do you think they might go negative? What do you think? What do you think about this whole low-rate strategy when they've got nowhere else to go? What's happening there?
Right. Well, I think a lot of that is attitudinal in essence. Essentially, I think in this cycle of the economy, a lot of people and a lot of businesses have become addicted to this environment of low interest rates. And breaking that addiction is difficult because it's not just based on objective considerations, it's also based on expectations. So I think a lot of the central bankers are afraid that if they raise the interest rates even a little bit, then the figurative house of cards might collapse. A more, let's say, substantial worry in terms of responses to ongoing policy, let's say, mishaps, would be in regard to the economic warfare that the Trump administration is waging against pretty much the rest of the world, imposing tariffs left and right with its anti-immigration rhetoric. It's also discouraging a lot of peaceful economic transactions. So that, from a directional standpoint, is definitely detrimental to economic growth, once again, using insights from the Austrian School of Economics. So perhaps some of the central bankers who don't necessarily buy into the virtues of low interest rate policy might still be cautious about raising the interest rates because they think perhaps now is not the right time, given that the economic policies of the Trump administration are so detrimental. And this is even beyond any sort of debate among economic schools. So the Austrians and the Keynesians will generally disagree about monetary policy and fiscal policy. They generally will agree that tariffs are a terrible idea, and that tariffs ultimately hurt the population of the country that is imposing them, even to a greater extent than the country on which they are levied. So the Trump administration's economic illiteracy is, I would say, of an entirely different caliber from what I would say are the mistakes of the Keynesians. But the Keynesians at least have a well thought out theory behind their mistakes, whereas Trumpian protectionism is based on, I would say, a very base impulse, for lack of a better term, and that is, well, these are our businesses. We need to protect our businesses against them foreigners. And that is no way to enact policy.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with national security, with IP theft. And they know it's a tax on the American population. They know it's going to drive goods and services price up, but they don't really care because it's more money for the American government to pay back on their ever-increasing debt load. Hey, we have to run into some more advances in the show. So the CEO of ARK Investment Management, Dr. Woods, outlined some huge transformative changes in a recent report. And we're going to run through some of these changes, and we're going to get your thoughts on it for the investors out there, because the investors are all flocking to this show. They're talking about power and money. And you're an expert on technology and transformative change, the future, and all that good stuff. So she said in this report that mobile transactions could grow 15 times by 2020. So basically by 2020, 75% of the world's, it will be smartphones and smart technologies. Already in Africa and other places, it's virtually more than that. We're looking at a $1 trillion economy up to a $15 trillion economy, a massive surge. What do you think of mobile transactions and the emerging markets such as India, China, and Africa in the mobile phone market and phone transactions?
So the advantage of mobile technology is that it is relatively inexpensive to deploy, especially in countries without a lot of pre-existing industrial infrastructure. And so as a result, you're correct that in developing countries especially, there has been rapid adoption because it's a lot easier to purchase a mobile phone, even though it might be a big chunk of a person's budget in those countries, than to have a more traditional telecommunications system. Also, mobile phones are highly attractive to populations in those countries because a lot of what you can do with a mobile phone is quite inexpensive. There are a lot of free apps. There's the advantage of near instantaneous communication at virtually no cost. And of course, mobile phones also facilitate mobile payments, which are extremely important in countries where the currency is in even far worse shape than the US dollar or a lot of Western currencies, and that from month to month, one can't rely on even relative stability of prices. And in those circumstances, having a mobile payment system, ideally detached from any sort of central bank or fiat currency, would definitely help. So this is why cryptocurrencies are also becoming popular along with mobile devices. And for instance, in Kenya, they have their own digital currency. It's not quite a cryptocurrency, but one could say it's a precursor digital currency called M-Pesa, which is used for a lot of small-scale transactions. The more these technologies spread, the more immunized the population is going to become against local currency manipulations. And of course, the ease of economic transactions is also greatly improved if you can pay someone remotely via your mobile device. So a lot of people will see mobile phones as an aid to economic development. I can definitely see a 15-fold growth during the next decade.
Yeah, and this especially helps small primary producers and farmers and agricultural people as well who don't have access to even urban resources. Robotics and automation is coming. It's coming down the track. There's two sides of the debate. One side says it's destroying growth and replacing it with productivity. Another side say, well, the productivity leads to further growth. In the United States, you're having issues with truck. What do you think? Do you think that robotics is productivity? Do you think that it will add to GDP or subtract from GDP? Because this is the debate around robotics.
I would say robotics would definitely add to productivity. Now, with regard to GDP, I have long thought GDP is a bit of an artificial measure because it doesn't reflect all of the sources of economic benefit for which there is no direct compensation. So for instance, back in the early 1990s, when people had to pay for their email services would have contributed to GDP. Now that email services are free and ubiquitous and so much better in every dimension, email services do not contribute to GDP. And yet we are better off objectively because a lot of technologies are so abundant as to be virtually free. I think with robotics and automation, we're going to see an increase in that kind of abundance, an increase in productivity and production of goods and services to the point where a lot of them become very cheap and nearly free. Is there going to be a transition in terms of the composition of jobs. I would say, yes, there will be a transition, but that transition is going to be more akin to what we have seen in every era of significant technological progress. We do not have 90% of the human population working on farms anymore. We do not have a large population of horse and buggy drivers, except for, let's say, entertainers in historic districts of cities. And there are a lot of other occupations that have been made obsolete. A lot of factory jobs, assembly line jobs, for instance, have been replaced by robots. But I would say ultimately this is a benefit, including to the workers whose jobs are being replaced, because generally speaking, those jobs tend to be quite grueling, they tend to be quite menial, they have adverse health effects, and they don't utilize the human creative faculty optimally or even anywhere near desirable levels. If you're standing in an assembly line putting on the same bolt time and time again on 1,000 parts per hour, and you do that for 8 hours, you're going to have significant strain, you're going to have significant boredom, and you're going to definitely not lead a high quality of life.
That's a very Isaac Asimovian statement. I love it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you. And I do greatly admire Isaac Asimov and his thinking. I read him fairly early on in my life during my early teenage years. So definitely a great man. And I would say the opportunity to find new jobs will be there. We're not going to have a situation where all jobs are going to become obsolete all at once. Some jobs, even in the service sector or in the professional sector that currently require human effort, are going to be automated away. But at the same time, people can retrain, and furthermore, new opportunities are going to arise. Just because you deploy a robot doesn't mean that that robot is automatically going to take care of itself all of the time. Somebody is going to need to maintain the robot. Somebody is going to need to design better robots. Somebody is going to need to be the backup in case the robot fails or exhibits some unexpected behavior. But we still want some humans in customer service positions. For instance, if you go to an automated checkout in a grocery store and you use one of the checkout machines, most of the time they work fine, but occasionally they throw an unexpected error. You want to have a clerk there to be able to override the error. So for a long time, we are going to have those kinds of opportunities. But furthermore, opportunities to use creative judgment in collaboration with machines are going to only expand, I think, because if machines allow us to have the productive ability to undertake more new projects or test out more possibilities, as for instance in music, a composer right now can test out a lot more interesting melodic combinations or orchestrations of a work than a composer could 200 years ago, when he would have had to hire an orchestra essentially to play anything that he envisioned. So creativity will be increased, and more opportunities to deploy what are still uniquely human faculties will arise.
An argument that I always think of is Western countries deployed a form of automation. It was called the US dollar, and they automated or they outsourced all of their labor already to other countries which had human inputs, not robot inputs, and all they were left with was the washover, the high-tech washover. And now the high-tech washover is sort of being slowly misplaced. It's people ignore that argument. They think, oh, my job's disappearing to the robots. No, your job is already a replacement of what doesn't exist, because of older tools and instruments like the US dollar, which is outsourced labor. Fleets of autonomous vehicles to overtake automakers. So this was an interesting one. Today, automakers have a market cap of around 115, but they're expected to go to a $10 trillion market. We've got a handful of companies that dominate this market right now, and Tesla is looking very good. Uber's looking very good. Ola is looking good. Automated cars, what do you think with all this decentralized platforms that people run their programs on?
I think autonomous vehicles are going to be a tremendous boon to humanity, not just from the standpoint of economic benefits, but primarily from the standpoint of saving lives. In the United States alone, about 40,000 people die every year from car accidents, and the vast majority, about 95% of those, are due to human error. So if 95% of deaths from auto accidents are eliminated in the US and worldwide, we are talking about millions of lives saved every year. And that, I think, would represent a tremendous triumph for humanity and for technological progress. But there are other significant advantages. A lot of time would be liberated, especially in big cities where people often make extensive commutes to work from a suburban location into the city. Imagine if they could use the 2 hours or so they spent commuting more productively by reading or catching up on their correspondence or transacting business. That's a huge economic boost right there. And furthermore, I think in terms of the benefits to the broader society, in terms of how the culture will change, I think autonomous vehicles will definitely provide for improvements there. Because imagine if all the road rage disappeared. Imagine if pedestrians and car occupants began to get along. Imagine if at the start of your day, when you're going to work, you don't have this quite challenging, in fact, task in front of you. This is one of the most dangerous tasks that most people engage in today because their jobs, especially if they're office-based jobs, are relatively safe. But you're operating a machine that has tremendous killing potential if used in the wrong ways. And you're hurtling down the highway at, 100 kilometers per hour in this machine, and it's all dependent on you. It's all dependent on your focus. It's all dependent on your skill, on your ability to anticipate unusual situations. That's tough for a lot of people. I would imagine that if driving became automated, stress levels throughout the society would decline. And this is one of the major challenges of our era. With all of the technological progress thus far, contemporary societies have still not discovered good, reliable ways to handle stress. So any technology that relieves the strain on the individual human being and enables people to focus on what is substantively valuable to them rather than on the efforts that just have to be exerted for day-to-day living would, I think, make a tremendous difference in that regard.
As a user of public transport and of Uber and other things, and someone who doesn't actually own a car, I've never had the stress of having to drive, and it's fantastic. I obviously can drive, I've got my license and all that, but I choose not to because I don't really need to. But yeah, life's much better. And when you were saying imagine, you were sounding like John Lennon for a second there. Imagine all the people getting together on the road. It was very nice. Deep learning could be worth 35 Amazons. So deep learning, as we know, it's a subcategory of machine learning, which is subcategory of artificial intelligence, which you and I are going to talk about in a bit. AI is really big. But Bill Gates, he was on CNN or some sort of forum, and he said that it's going to be worth 10 Microsofts, 550 to 600 billion. This is going to be deep learning. So deep learning, it's a huge industry. It's a massive industry. What do you think about deep learning?
Well, I think deep learning is interesting in that it represents kind of the first forays into what one could consider creativity in artificially intelligent systems. So these systems aren't just ones that execute a predetermined set of instructions, even a very complex set of instructions, which AI systems for several decades have been able to do. These are systems that could arrive at interesting and novel answers. Think of Google's Deep Dream Generator as an example. I, at one point, created a fractal where I started with a fairly typical fractal design, though there is such an immense diversity of fractal designs. But I fed it into the Deep Dream Generator, and along with that, I fed in pictures of various desserts. And it's interesting because the fractal kind of looks like an ornate dessert tray, And the Deep Dream Generator did some interesting transformations with regard to those pictures of desserts. And really, the end result doesn't look representational per se, but there are definite dessert motifs in the geometric shapes that the Deep Dream Generator came up with. So that's an example of how an artificially intelligent system can bring out certain, what I would call, creative capabilities. And yes, they still have to be guided in certain directions in order for the product to be meaningful, but they could come up with combinations that a human would not be able to arrive at, and that just adds to the arsenal of creative outputs that we have at our disposal.
So I forgot to add, so they're looking at the deep learning cap of 17 trillion in market cap. That's what the number I was trying to get to. That's the 35 Amazons. I was trying to think in my head, how is it 600 billion, 35 Amazons? Doesn't really make sense, but yeah. So 3D printing is going to be big, right? And we're talking about moon, and it'll be great. But according to this report, it's a $41 billion industry by 2020. And as 2025, almost $500 billion. Transhumanist Party has a lot to do with 3D printing. Not that they don't have a lot to do with other stuff, but what do you think, what's the future of 3D printing? Also, is some of that in arms or is that in construction? Because I know I've seen two different things. I've seen in China, they're building houses and they've done the whole construction. And then in America, they're having the big debates on whether or not the source code should be out there to print guns. What do you think?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think the 3D printed gun debate is largely a distraction. It's essentially one of those wedge issues, as the whole debate over gun control generally is. But a tiny minority of 3D printing efforts are directed toward firearms today. Construction is a much more common aspiration, and indeed 3D printing could do so much to render housing affordable. If one can 3D print the frame of a home, especially in such a way as to accommodate utilities and other types of conveniences that one needs in a contemporary lifestyle, then that could lead to affordable housing for everybody, essentially. And furthermore, 3D printing could enable construction in otherwise hostile environments. So if a good, reliable 3D printing robot could be sent to Mars, for instance, and use the local soil to create materials, to 3D print a base there, then that base could potentially be ready for human colonists before those colonists arrive. Again, make the early colonization experience a bit less grueling, a bit less stressful. And then there are the consumer uses of 3D printing. There have been tabletop 3D printers already, like the MakerBots and other brands. I think right now that market is largely dedicated either to trinkets, jewelry, or plastic toys, or parts, specialized parts for particular tools or machines. And that has industrial applications as well, because you can 3D print certain parts, for instance, to have a single piece instead of being assembled from multiple pieces, and that could improve the longevity and reliability of those parts. It would be very interesting to see 3D printing expand into foods and into organs. Right now there are some efforts along those lines, but they haven't yet reached mass consumer adoption. If they do reach mass consumer adoption and mass adoption by medical businesses, that is going to be quite transformative, because you could have your own cells used to 3D print a kidney or 3D print a windpipe, which has been done already experimentally. What if we could get to the point where, though this is much more complex, human heart could be 3D printed, or human lungs could be 3D printed. A lot of patients could be saved without the risk of immune system rejection, which often does happen with transplants today. That, I think, is a tremendously promising aspect of the technology. So in the vast majority of situations, I see 3D printing being used for peaceful purposes, essentially to build or to improve the quality of life or to improve health. Now, could someone 3D print a part for a weapon just like they could 3D print a part for a tractor or an assembly line robot? That's going to be a tiny minority of the market.
It's also kind of irrelevant in the United States when the availability of access to ability to weapons is, it's quite easy to access weapons. In Australia, that's a different debate because weapons are illegal and we have strict firearm control. So it's a little bit of a different debate. In America, it's not so much. CRISPR is huge. I mean, this is massive. And the big story about CRISPR is the cost just keeps falling. The technology is getting better, but the cost is falling. It's almost like Moore's Law over there. What do you think of the future of CRISPR and the market and the utility of CRISPR?
Well, I think CRISPR is one technology in a series that will enable increasingly effective genetic engineering. CRISPR is still not precise enough for most scientists to be comfortable using it in humans, though some have tried. There was the case recently of the Chinese doctor who essentially edited the genome of two twins, I believe, to render them resistant to HIV. And this was highly controversial. I, for one, am supportive of gene editing as long as it's not risky to the life form that results. So if the gene editing can be performed safely and it confers health benefits to a new human being, then I would be entirely in favor of it. If there is a significant risk of errors, malfunctions, or unexpected consequences through deleterious mutations, then I would say more research is needed before human trials may begin. But it's an entirely pragmatic type of consideration. So as gene editing technologies improve, as they become more precise and more affordable, I think safety is also going to improve. So one concern that I have is there could be a kind of reflexive backlash amongst politicians and the general public, and a lot of scientists, out of fear, would restrict themselves and members of their community from performing experiments that are indeed safe and beneficial to the resulting human beings. One way in which I think this could be bypassed is through a greater emphasis on somatic gene editing as opposed to embryonic gene editing, because with somatic gene editing, you could edit the genes of an adult and get the consent of that individual and have a kind of proof of concept that this works in an adult human being, this is safe, and people want it, people have a higher quality of life. And then to move on to embryos, one essentially, I think, would need to get a broader comfort level among the greater society that this isn't something nefarious. And unfortunately, a lot of people still have misconceptions about gene editing, and they instantly think of Frankenstein when they think of gene editing, which is just essentially a cultural stumbling block. But nonetheless, I see the advances as encouraging. I think the culture and the society have a long way to go to catch up, but this is one reason why the U.S. Transhumanist Party is engaged in its advocacy of emerging technologies. We're seeking to change that mindset.
Yeah, and as long as the cost keeps falling, the governments and people who don't hold those values are going to keep experimenting with this. And I think it's inevitable, even if the worlds do clash. So science fiction forms the foundation of everything we kind of think about the future. Not technically, but as a general sort of rule, because that's how we project into the future. Do you have a favorite science fiction author?
Well, I have quite a few authors whose works I've enjoyed, so it's difficult to pinpoint a favorite. I think Robert Heinlein is a great author, most definitely. His short novel, Methuselah's Children, was actually one of the first book-length works about indefinite life extension, works of fiction, essentially. And then, of course, Isaac Asimov, a great pioneer in science fiction about robotics, about future civilizations. Arthur C. Clarke also, I think, laid a lot of the foundations of what we envision the future to be and what we envision space colonization to be. I tend to be more fond of, let's say, the classic science fiction writers, and those would include, say, Ray Bradbury. Fahrenheit 451 is definitely a cautionary tale about essentially techno-Luddism and the rejection of knowledge. Another interesting writer, less well known, is Walter M. Miller Jr., who wrote a Canticle for Leibowitz, kind of a story about a post-nuclear apocalypse world where some aspects of knowledge were preserved after a kind of techno-Luddite wave of destruction, and they're gradually being rediscovered, and knowledge is gradually being rekindled. It's not a techno-optimistic work, so there are some premises in it that I differ with, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting read, and it definitely does portray some of the dangers of techno-Luddism very well. So I would say one of the hallmarks of science fiction that really inspired a lot of the late 20th and early 21st century technologies was a kind of hopefulness of vision, even when that fiction portrayed major challenges or major setbacks. It did so in a way that didn't necessarily signal the inevitability of failure, the inevitability of defeat on the part of humankind. So there was this premise that technology could make life better, and that embracing technology could improve the world in qualitative ways. And unfortunately, I think largely because of Hollywood sensationalism, a lot of science fiction has become dystopian today. And even when you look at Asimov's I, Robot, which was a collection of short stories with interesting premises about the 3 laws of robotics and exceptional circumstances in which they were deployed. And instead, you have this Will Smith movie by the same title, I, Robot, from the mid-2000s, but it is nothing like the Asimov stories, and it has a very, let's say, anti-technological message, anti-automation, anti-robotics, which Asimov would not have condoned in the least. So I think there's a qualitative difference in science fiction, at least prevailing science fiction, from that golden age to today. And we need more hopeful science fiction in our era if we are to inspire people to tackle the challenges of the transition.
Yeah, because I read iRobot, and because I watched the movie, and that inspired me to read it when a long time ago. And I was like, how are these two correlated? It was a woman reflecting on her life, and then it was techno-positivism, and I was like, what? These are two completely different. But anyway, they just took the laws and basically just used that as a foundation work for whatever they wanted to do, which is, it was kind of interesting. Also, speaking of neo-Luddism, I asked Isaac after this, do you think that there will be some sort of uprising against social media? Because I think that that's where people will vent their anger eventually. I think a lot of people don't understand a lot of the technologies and the technology curve that's coming. But something they do understand is they do understand that Mark Zuckerberg deletes their account, and they get angry at that, right? So do you think there will be some sort of rising up of the peasants against the social media giants?
I think we're already seeing this, and oddly enough, the uprising is leading the social media giants to create policies that I would say are a lot less palatable than the original policies that people were upset about. I remember the Facebook of approximately 2013 or 2014, when I would say there was genuine free speech on Facebook. There probably was some moderation of egregious content, but for the most part, people could express their honest opinions civilly. Facebook has been changing its algorithms to essentially deliberately emphasize or de-emphasize certain content. It is becoming more difficult to have meaningful intellectual exchanges on social media. And I think this is tragic because this is all directly in response to complaints by the media, the more conventional media who are threatened by social media, by politicians, and by a large fearful segment of the public. And there are, let's say, certain high-profile instances of abuse, which were genuine abuse, that are being invoked in this, say, Cambridge Analytica illegitimately accessing people's data, or whenever there's a technical glitch or a data breach. Those are serious problems. But if the backlash to those problems is disproportionate, people would abandon a lot of the good aspects of social media, including the fact that social media do tend to connect people more and do tend to give people more information and a broader diversity of perspectives. Now, in that, is there a possibility for self-imposed filter bubbles or self-imposed tribalism? Yes, but nonetheless, I think on net, social media could be beneficial with better policies. But I prefer a vision that's closer to the original. So give me back the Facebook of 2008 or 2014, because I think that would actually be a more constructive forum for intellectual exchange than the Facebook of today.
So it's something interesting is politically, the Tea Party, if you go back and watch Tea Party documentaries of the conservatives in America, those Tea Party people, they were praising Facebook, and they were saying that they didn't have free speech in real life after the Obama elections, and that Facebook was their place to run and spread their messages and stuff. And that's done a whole backflip, and now conservatives are saying online that they're being targeted. So Facebook really is in control of who says what and who does what. The other thing is the algorithms, which you mentioned. I think they're locking people into logic loops, because the more they agree with content, the more content they see, the more of that they see, the more they agree with it, because that's what they see. And so they're getting locked into echo chambers a little bit, and it's hard for people to break out of those echo chambers. Even for me, I like one thing, and then suddenly got bombarded with a ton of that same stuff, and it's like, no, I'm trying to find the future stuff or the business stuff. I want one piece of business news, and suddenly my page is overwhelmed with business news or future news, and it's just echo chamberish. It's very annoying. Putting that aside, if we do, regardless of whether we have a uprising against the elites or not in the Facebook social media world, space colonization. We're going into space. It's happening. Lift costs are coming down. We're looking at space elevators. They're not here yet. They're on their way. Are you in favor? Isaac Arthur, I was talking to him. He said, let's go to the moon first. Forget Mars. Mars isn't that important. Elon's is a vanity project, essentially. Let's go to the moon. Let's get the rare resources, rare minerals. It's very close. You know, we can transport water there. We can import raw material, rare materials back. We can learn how to live in space a lot better, like we've learned a little bit how to live in space with the ISS. Are you in favor of going straight to Mars, doing the big jump, or you want to go to the moon? What's the transhumanist sort of idea?
I would say do both simultaneously as rapidly as possible, because if there's interest in either, say if Elon Musk is interested in going to Mars and Jeff Bezos is interested in going to the moon, and they're willing to dedicate resources to that, and others are willing to dedicate resources to orbital space stations or to asteroid mining, none of these are mutually exclusive. In fact, development in any of these directions is going to help develop in others. So there would be some synergies there, new discoveries, new vehicles to convey both materials and humans. And furthermore, the development of an infrastructure in space that could support projects that were originated elsewhere. So if there is a base on the moon, that could be used as a launching point for expeditions to asteroids or flights to Mars. If there's a base on Mars, people are going to think, well, we need to somehow support that, and maybe we need to do more than just launch a large rocket every once in a while. Let's start building out our orbital infrastructure, or let's go to the moon and create a waypoint there. So the order of operations, in my view, isn't as important as having movement in all of those areas. I do think it's a tragedy that it has been 50 years since humans first landed on the moon, and now 47 years since the last human stepped on the moon. And I think this needs to change. I actually quite sympathize with Donald Trump's sentiments here. I disagree with the vast majority of Trump's policies, but when he became president, it is told that he asked the NASA administrator at that time, well, if you had an unlimited budget, how quickly could you get humans to return to the moon? And unfortunately, what he was told was, even with an unlimited budget, it would still take more years than the Trump administration would last, because essentially we don't have the industrial infrastructure that the U.S. developed very quickly in the 1960s to support the Apollo program. And it is such a tragedy that that has been allowed to languish. So I think a major priority should be to restore that infrastructure. And that infrastructure, I think, could be most readily justified if it has multiple uses. So yes, use it for moon flights, use it for flights to Mars, use it for orbital and suborbital development, use it to experiment with advanced aircraft. The more purposes you could think of, the more spillover economic benefits you could think of, the more readily that infrastructure will justify itself.
Yeah, so what do you think? Do you think that corporations or national governments are going to win this race? And if it advances, who's going to start winning this race? Is it governments that are going to go out there? Are they going to be able to maintain control? Or is it going to be corporates, and we're all going to have to jump into a corporate suit if we want to become a multiplanetary species?
I think at first we're going to see some sort of system of public-private partnerships, as has been de facto happening with SpaceX. SpaceX is most certainly the most successful commercial space enterprise right now, though I would say Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, has also been doing impressive things. Virgin Galactic has been doing impressive things. And again, they're building this infrastructure, but in part, they're going to do so relying on government contracts. And I just hope that those contracts are going to be for largely peaceful purposes, so running scientific experiments in space or improving GPS technology and not spy satellites, for instance, or finding ways to launch nuclear warheads from space. So there is a risk whenever you have private-public partnerships in that there would be strings attached and there would be political directions or restrictions on development. However, over time, in order to have a viable space industry and in order to viably expand beyond the Earth for large numbers of humans, the private sector is going to need to be substantially more involved. And the way to achieve that is for costs to come down further so that small-ish businesses could participate. And those would still be businesses with tens of millions of dollars of resources at the very least. But imagine, say, a scenario similar to how the New World was colonized. It wasn't all done by large governments or large commercial entities. Some groups of people essentially decided to emigrate for various reasons. They could have been religious dissenters, or they could have been seeking wealth, they could have been seeking gold or more land for themselves because the old world was crowded. So if there are similar motivations that arise among ordinary people and relatively ordinary business owners, that's when we're going to see a massive wave of space settlement. But of course, the groundwork has to be laid for that. Unfortunately, neither the moon nor Mars are as hospitable to life as the New World was. Although we do have better technology now, and the New World wasn't always a pleasant place either. There are so many accounts of early colonists dying of infectious diseases or being slaughtered by the natives or just failing to build viable settlements. I think our standards are higher now. People who go to the moon or Mars will expect to live what would be the typical life expectancy at the time, and they would expect some measure of comfort, not as much as on Earth, but certainly they wouldn't be content with what some of the early American colonists were facing. But that, I think, is what will need to happen for sustainable space development.
Yeah, my argument has always been that since the Industrial Revolution, and they've learned how labor is a component, and they started to look after their workers as systems production, that's kind of the values and the standards that you talk about have gone higher because human value itself has gone higher. If you work off just a simple supply and demand, if you go to a country where there's a large population, demand and value of those people is less. And now we've invested more in our people, so there's more. If you go into a NASA institution, or you look at the way that they take care of their astronauts or the president of the United States or high value people, it's enormous. You invest enormous amount of resources into a high value person, and other value people you don't invest so many resources in, or you let the market take care of those people. So or you give them a government settling or a benefit, a social benefit, and say, all right, we're going to take care of that problem that way. So the people who go into space tourism, space infrastructure, all that sort of stuff, they're going to be higher value people. And I think the standards and the cooperative notion between private government sector and law is going to be higher on the fact that these are higher value activities that we're doing, because we're talking about the future of everything that ever is, that we all know that life is only a very limited spectrum, and if we can break out and become multiplanetary, it doesn't have to be. Right now we're sitting at the mercy of a solar storm, we're sitting at the mercy of a climatic event, we're sitting at the mercy of Earth's magnetosphere or something. We're held captive by this planet, and we have to figure out how to get off it in order to perpetuate ourselves, regardless of what happens with AI uploading and uploading our conscious to an artificial carrier, because that won't actually mean very much in the long run. So, well, moving on. So in going on with that, I see today's world. There's a huge gross misallocation of resources pumped into a consumer economy. It's essentially, it's not the free market's fault, but it's kind of bread and circuses, because we've got geopolitical issues and we've got tribal issues and we've hoarded people. Since the agricultural revolution, you've had the domestication of plants and animals and humans, which is what people don't forget, and that's what we call nations, that's what we call tribes and tribalism and things like that. So there's been a lot of misallocation of resources into going into flags and into nationalism and to all this sort of stuff to distract people and to aggregate power and to build up architecture that doesn't need to be there and stuff like that. Dmitry Iskov sees the same thing. What do you say? Do you see the same thing? Do you see a huge misallocation of resources? The financial market's an obvious one, but do you see a misallocation of resources nowadays?
Well, I think some misallocations of resources are quite apparent. Tobacco products still have a big market, for instance, and there doesn't seem to be a rational purpose for that, other than some people are addicted to the substance and they see it as an escape from what may be a difficult world, or they see it as pleasurable but certainly not contributing to the progress of humankind. There are a lot of distractions in the world right now. I think a lot of those distractions are born out of a sense of powerlessness and resignation in many people, in that they just don't envision life becoming materially better. So they think, all right, let's take our pleasure while we can, because we're not sure if we're going to be around tomorrow or the next decade or certainly the next century. And unfortunately, because life was so harsh and so suboptimal for the vast majority of human existence, people have developed very elaborate systems of rationalization. I have written about this extensively. This is why so many people are reflexively opposed to indefinite life extension. They don't see it as a feasible outcome and so they try to convince themselves that death is not so bad. I think in a world where progress were palpable and one could see more directly the connection between one's efforts and an improvement to the state of the world, a lot of those mindsets would change. But it's a gradual process because culture is among the most difficult factors to change. This is where I think I side with people who make more moderate forecasts than Ray Kurzweil in terms of the rate of technological adoption. So Ray Kurzweil focuses on accelerating growth in technical capabilities, and he notes that a lot of technologies follow trajectories of technical improvements similar to Moore's law or even better. But at the same time, if in the broader society there is lack of awareness of these technologies or reluctance or resistance toward adopting them, that could definitely slow down the rate of progress. So as far as I'm aware, Kurzweil keeps saying that his predictions have largely turned out to be correct from a technical standpoint. For instance, autonomous vehicle technology was available in some form, not as well developed as it is today, but enough for various test cars in 2009 when he anticipated that technology would arrive. But still, one cannot go and purchase a level 5 autonomous vehicle from a dealer today or from a private party. They're just not there for consumers. And I think this is because the legal, cultural, attitudinal barriers have unfortunately been greater than Kurzweil foresaw. So it is very important to reconfigure public attitudes through advocacy, through the spread of correct information, and through demonstrations of how this new technology can improve lives and give hope to people who might otherwise not have had hope.
What about people who attack you saying you're contributing to the problem of overpopulation? I'm going to throw you some of the common arguments. And they say, you're the problem. You're the big problem. They say there's going to be a loss of fresh water, species extinction, lower life expectancy in the fastest growing countries, less freedom, more restrictions, depletion of natural resources, increased emergence of new epidemics and pandemics, increased global warming and climate change, more intensive farming practice, increased habitat loss because of farming habitats and industrialization, and elevated crime rates because of the slums. And they're saying you, Gennady, are contributing to all this because you're making people live longer. What do you say to those people? How do you come back at that?
I would say, first of all, those people should come to Nevada and see the abundance of open, undeveloped land that exists there. I think their frames of, let's say, perception are skewed by the fact that they may be spending a lot of their time in particular very congested, crowded areas in big cities, but that is not what the entire world is like. In fact, multiple models have shown that you could really fit all of humankind within the size of the land area of approximately the state of Texas in the U.S. if all of that area were urbanized and you put all of the farms and all of the factories in close proximity. It's just for various economic reasons, human beings have tended to cluster in certain areas, generally areas with access to fresh water or bodies of water that enable transportation, and those became big cities, and through path dependency they kept growing while other areas were more sparsely populated. So if the vast majority of humans are concentrated in a few areas, they're going to think the world is a lot more crowded than it actually is. The fact is, we have more people right now on Earth than at any point in history, yet standards of living are also higher than at any point in history, especially in countries that have been poorer in the past and are still relatively poor. But the great success story of the past 40 years has been the massive improvement in living standards in most of Asia, in Latin America, and even many parts of Africa, where, for instance, life expectancies used to be in the 30s and they're now in the 50s. And that's still quite unfortunate that life expectancies are so low. But they had never been in the 50s in some of those countries before. We do not have a shortage of food. We have certain parts of the world with terrible policies and poor infrastructure that prevents the delivery of food. And we have terrible policies in more advanced countries, like laws that prohibit restaurants or grocery stores from feeding the homeless with food that is inevitably left over at the end of the day. If human policies were more consistently pro-development, there would be no resource shortages anywhere. And I would add, furthermore, birth rates decline everywhere in the world as industrialization and education advance.
Yeah, as the wealth increases, it's over and over and over again. It's shown throughout history. As wealth increases, your birth rate always declines. So even Mexico is one of the lowest birth rate places in the world, and yet Americans think that there's going to be an infinite supply of people coming out from Mexico. It's kind of a farce. Or India's now dropping. China is depleting, but that was assisted by the one-child policy. Japan is collapsing. Russia is collapsing, as we know. So yes, it's as wealth goes up, you get less people, and the children that do exist, as we explained before, they turn into an asset, and then you invest more resources into each child, and your literacy, numeracy, and other rates go up, and then also the society cares about these people, and they invest more resources into the diseases that afflict these children and things like that, which is why you get the research projects globally. Hey, I just want to turn to the U.S. Transhuman Party agenda, because then I want to talk about some of these other texts. So your core ideals, your ideal one is the Transhumanist Party supports significant life extension achieved through the progress of science technology. Ideal 2, the Transhumanist Party supports cultural, societal, and political atmosphere informed and animated by reason, science, and secular values. And your idea 3 is the Transhumanist Party supports the efforts to use science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate various existential risks from the human species. Now, that sounds very different to what we were just talking about with the people saying, you're encouraging overpopulation. How do you reconcile you're encouraging population and longer lifespan and these values?
Well, I would say longer lifespan is the solution for all of the problems that we see in the world today, and it's certainly part of the suite of technological advances that are going to need to occur. But my bold and ambitious claim that I will make today on your show is that all of the major problems that humankind will ever face already exist today in significant forms, including existential risks to our very species, both from an asteroid impact, and we still haven't identified all of the near-Earth objects, or from man-made calamity like nuclear war, for instance. And we still have a situation where one person, say the President of the United States, could make a unilateral decision to destroy the entire world. And in order to overcome those problems, as well as the age-old perils that have faced humankind, such as death, disease, scarcity, the propensity toward conflict, various psychological flaws and cognitive biases, the tendency toward fallacious thinking, we need more technological progress. And we need more incentives for technological progress. And I think the greatest incentive for progress is for people to believe that they will be around to benefit from it. The longer people live, the longer their time horizons are, the more they will consider their long-term impacts in their decision-making. So if one considers, say, environmental effects, the effects of pollution, well, if you're going to be alive 500 years from now, you're going to care about what the environment will look like 500 years from now. And some people say, oh, but they care about future generations, and maybe they care about their children or grandchildren, but that's about as far as they can foresee. They're really not going to say, I'm making this decision because I want my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren to have a good quality of life. That person might not think of progeny that far removed, and progeny that far removed will certainly not remember their ancestor in all but a very few exceptional circumstances. So clearly a different motivation is needed for some of these longer term solutions to human problems. And that's not even to mention the various natural disasters that can arise, the threat of a supervolcano, for instance, or a massive earthquake or a new ice age. I think those can be fairly sizable, if not existential, threats to the human species. But if humans can live for hundreds or thousands of years, and hopefully live indefinitely, there will be far more motivation to overcome those threats.
It's not, just to clarify to the audience, it's not technology for technology's sake. It's technological progress couched within ethical and logical considerations, steering for on a positive bent, correct?
Yes, absolutely. This is why the Transhumanist Party so strongly emphasizes moral philosophy and rationality and informed policies that make the best use of technology. That's why we devote so much of our effort toward advocating for electoral reform or exemplifying electoral reform through our own internal ranked preference voting system. This is why we focused so extensively on the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which is now in its third iteration and which envisions the protections for sentient entities of the future that we would hope future societies will adopt. So ethics, rationality, informed uses of technology are of course crucial, because a lot of technologies are capable of being abused. This is true. I would still argue that on net, the vast majority of technologies, with the exception of weapons of mass destruction, are beneficial. But in order for them to be beneficial, of course, good judgment has to be used, and people have to continually educate themselves, and furthermore, there has to be a culture of intellectualism and intellectual advocacy that all too often I see lacking today. But the Transhumanist Party is doing what it can to shift the balance.
And I agree with you in the fact that we are being basically judged by future AI and future sentience, what we perceive as the future anyway, now on how we approach this issue. Because, I mean, computers, especially technology, is rapidly advancing, and we're going to have to plug something into it. I mean, Ray Kurzweil is absolutely correct, and Hollywood is absolutely incorrect, because Hollywood frames the advancing AI issue as some big supercomputer. iRobot was a perfect example. It's just some big supercomputer, and it's one single AI, and it knows everything, and it connects into everything, and it's like a Google internet sort of complex. But it's not the truth of how AI works. AI is in your watch. AI is separate. It's billions of them all over doing separate things, and it's not one interconnected entity. And eventually, we will have to plug something in. And this is what the Transhumanist Party is trying to do, right? This is what I understand. The Transhumanist Party is saying we'll get the right, we'll mix the right potion in, and be able to feed the right thing into the machine. Because if you look out into the wider world, you don't want to plug any of that into the machine, because if the machine understands that what humans are by looking around the world, we're not going to end up with a very nice machine.
That reminds me of Tay the chatbot, who was deployed onto Twitter a few years ago to learn what it could from Twitter, and unfortunately Tay became a neo-Nazi and began essentially posting these hate-filled rants on Twitter. So clearly, completely unsupervised learning by AI would not be ideal. It would essentially lead the AI to indiscriminately pick up whatever it sees and not make moral distinctions, because it won't have moral distinctions unless it is given some sort of framework within which to make them. So a lot of transhumanists are indeed concerned with and focused on AI safety and designing AI systems so as not to have unintended consequences. And I think that's quite a worthwhile pursuit. I think, fortunately, the balance of intellect is on our side. I'm not a, let's say, doomsayer with regard to AI, because I believe a lot of conscientious researchers are dedicating their efforts toward developing rational and moral AI systems. And that contingent, I think, hugely overpowers those rogue developers who potentially might be trying to create hostile AI or indiscriminate AI. I would actually posit that the greater risk stems not from the smart algorithms of the future, but from the dumb algorithms of today. There are a lot of static algorithms that are used in decision making, including by financial institutions, which are far from optimal. And sometimes those algorithms are developed using mere statistical correlations between attribute A and attribute B, which is what the modelers are trying to get at. But often the design of those models doesn't even attempt to address real-world causation or how it is that attribute A might even plausibly affect attribute B. So one could have some fairly absurd outcomes with those models, and because they're static, they wouldn't be able to self-correct. They wouldn't be able to take in actual empirical data that would contradict the modeler's assumptions. So that exists today. That has existed for about 3 decades now. And I would say there is a greater danger of flawed decision-making with those algorithms than with algorithms that can learn based on external feedback. And certainly, if we develop sentient artificial general intelligence, the potential for learning, including learning in a moral sense, is going to be greatly increased. I do tend to believe that greater intelligence at least correlates with greater morality, though it doesn't guarantee greater morality. But a more intelligent entity is more likely to perceive win-win situations. It is less likely to see life as a zero-sum game, because in reality, there are many possible solutions to any given situation. Again, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, the world can be quite complex and multifaceted and messy at times, but entities with simpler frameworks of mind tend to think of only binary either or alternatives, like conventional warfare or lifeboat types of scenarios. Either I jump overboard and save my fellow human in the lifeboat, or I throw the fellow human overboard. Really, there's no third way. I find that very difficult to apply to any real world situation. And I think the more intelligence you have in the world, the more possibilities for third or fourth or 10 billionth ways there will be to solve various problems.
That's actually something you have to give that Will Smith I, Robot movie credit for, where they're drowning in the car and the robot evaluated the chances of living, and he said, all right, no, I would rather sacrifice myself as a human and you save the girl because the girl's got a longer life. I don't have as much motivation, etc., etc. But the robot did the calculation and it went, I'm saving you, haha. And then he didn't want to live after that. So that was kind of interesting. So we're going towards AI. And you're big on this convergence of technology. You like to talk about the convergence. I know that. So when we're talking about the convergence, we're talking about nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive technology, genetics, and robotics. Now those are the frameworks. And they're giving us all sorts of amazing things, like new sources of energy, new architecture and transportation, developments of cognitive developments in cognitive abilities, artificial intelligence and brain-computer interfaces, simulations, like these supercomputers can simulate complex systems and make economics a thing of the past, humanoid robots and cyborgs, manageable matter, which will be really cool. And ways to transfer personality to a new artificial carrier, right? So to do this, we need new civilizational paradigm, we need new philosophy, we need new ethics, new culture, new psychology, and new metaphysics. This is what the Transhumanist Party is all about. Are you the next president of the United States? That's my question. Not the next one, but are you a future president?
They'd have to amend the U.S. Constitution for that. In the meantime, though,
you're a dual citizen.
Well, yes, I was born in Belarus. I'm a U.S. citizen. I have been for the past 12 years now. But the U.S. Constitution, unfortunately, has the requirement that one needs to be a citizen by birth in order to become president. Again, it's quite an obsolete and I would say overly restrictive type of requirement. But in the current political climate, unfortunately, acceptance of non-native born Americans has declined compared to what it was when I first emigrated to the United States. And this, I think, is another area where a lot of work needs to be done before the U.S. Constitution stands a chance of being amended to be more open. But in the meantime, I am happy to essentially arrange and administer the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
That's fantastic. This is incredible because, yeah, it's all about the convergence. This is where it's going. And we need people in parties like the Transhumanist Party in order to lay the foundations, because the world is going into an unsteady, unstable area, unstable terrain. They're not sure what they're going to go into. I'm preparing for it myself, and I want to prepare the audience as well, because I want to take them through and make sure that they're not hit by any surprises. But the world has rapidly advanced since the baby boomers. I mean, they've done some absolutely rapid advance, but the advances that are coming aren't just going to be what humans can consider. They're going to be what these AI sort of semi-sentients can consider, because we're going into a bilateral sort of world where it's humans and AIs working together in order to achieve more things. Ray Kurzweil, he's a friend of yours. I very much would love to have him on the show. I don't think he'd probably ever come on the show. Another person that I'd love to have on the show is, I'm going to email him, is Zoltan Itzvan. Very, very fascinating human being who doesn't want to be a human being, ironically, but he's very fascinating. And he obviously did very well with the immortality bus. That brought a lot of notoriety to the Transhumanist Party, especially in the United States. I know I saw it over here in Australia because of the internet, but I'm guessing it had more of an impact where he went. He's kind of like almost a cooler version of Beto O'Rourke, I would say. So basically, humans are advancing. Humans have come out of foraging, pastoral society, this sort of horticulture, agriculture, industrial, post-industrial. We're heading towards the next quantum leap. But I have some ethical concerns. What do you think? Computers will pass the Turing test very soon. We're getting there. But what do you think of like things like Google and DeepMind and DARPA and these sort of dark forces that are sort of aligned and that want to use and utilize this in a sort of negative way? How do you guys battle against that? Because the negatives sometimes more attractive, especially to bad people or to those forces of security.
I think the answers are decentralization, transparency, and open source development of these technologies. So they wouldn't just be in the hands of a few governments or a few corporations. They would be at least accessible to an entire community of people who care about ethical outcomes and who simply want to develop good technologies that work and improve human well-being. The more transparency there is, the fewer, let's say, suspect manipulations there could be. And definitely, if only a small cohort of large organizations engages in the development, there are going to be problems. This is why having a grassroots transhumanist movement is essential, and why that movement needs to pull in people of a wide variety of backgrounds and specialties. In this technological convergence that we have been discussing, one of the greatest assets is going to be the ability of people to draw novel connections across disciplines. So a person specializing in one area cannot just be confined to that area. That person needs to see the applications to many other areas in order for the field to grow, in order to avoid this pigeonholing and hyper-specialization that have unfortunately characterized the late 20th century and perhaps impeded some progress then. So I would say the answer is for more of this technology to be discussed in public, to be developed transparently, and to be advocated for with an eye toward making it accessible, making it possible for ordinary people, for enthusiasts, to get involved in its development and in conversations around it.
I'm going to have a Russian gentleman who's part of Russia 2045 on, and he works for Dmitry. And I was saying to him, what's more important? Is the general public or getting a couple more billionaires onto your team? And he said, forget the general public. He said, forget them. All we need is a few more of these billionaires on our team, and then all we have to do is the selling process. That's essentially all he said. If we sell it correctly, you can forget about encouraging the general public to go along with these ideas. And all you need is it to be an elitist sort of thing. What do you say to that? Would you rather more billionaires to jump on, just a couple more billionaires, or would you like to see the general public moving in a general flocking direction?
I think you need both, but one aspect to consider, which I think this other Russian gentleman's viewpoint misses, is that almost every person in a position of power or prominence actually faces significant constraints from not just the culture, but other institutions with which this person interacts. If you're a billionaire, you have to deal with a lot of other stakeholders. You have to, if you are the head of a public company, deal with your board of directors and with your shareholders and with your regulators and with politicians and with financial analysts of your company and public opinion, the marketability of your products, all of these considerations. So people who are ostensibly very wealthy and very powerful are often quite boxed in to the decisions they feel like they have to make rather than the decisions they want to make and would have made had they been free of those kinds of constraints. So the answer to that is in this imperfect world where we can't quite free any individual from all of those constraints, unfortunately, we have to work on multiple aspects of the society at the same time. Yes, it helps for the billionaires to be a bit more open to technological progress and more willing to invest. But what they're willing to invest in is also going to be contingent on public acceptance. And acceptance, not just in terms of what can they find a market for, but even if this is just a personal project of theirs, they want it to be sufficiently uncontroversial that there won't be a mass uprising, at least among the stakeholders whose opinion matters to them. Aubrey de Grey, interestingly enough, has told me that he has spoken to a lot of wealthy individuals who are enthusiastic about life extension, but one of the biggest obstacles that they face is that their wives aren't, and their wives won't let them invest that money. So that's kind of a strange observation, but if they could persuade their wives to be more supportive of indefinite life extension, we might have a lot more millionaire or billionaire investors. But in order for that to happen, the whole culture needs to change. So those wealthy women have to also realize that life extension will benefit them and that life extension is something socially and culturally acceptable enough for them to essentially consider it a worthwhile investment. So again, that's a situation where you have wealthy people who could be helping out, but they are constrained.
Do you ever fear that you would become sort of like the bicentennial man if you had access to life extension? You know, where you pass over generations and sort of become lost in time and lonely and friendless? Or would you always just keep discovering new and innovative and creative things to do and not worry about other people who didn't have access to the same materials and the elixir of life and youth as you did, for example?
I think there is always so much more to discover and so many more activities to pursue than one has time for. And even if one had an indefinite lifespan, just the sheer abundance of human activity and discovery, the sheer abundance of new content that is created means that it would be impossible to exhaust it all. Indeed, I mention in Death is Wrong, even if one did nothing but read books all day and became an exceptionally fast reader and could read one book a day, well, there would be several thousand new books published during that very day. So one would never run out of things to do. In fact, the longer one lives, the more there will be to existence that one hasn't experienced yet. And that, I think, is a great impetus to live longer. I don't think a healthy and active mind would ever ossify. There are some people who are afraid that, if a given generation lives indefinitely, then that generation's habits or ways of thinking will become ingrained forever in the society. And I don't think that will happen, because a lot of this ossification is most likely a function of biological senescence, essentially. At some point, because the brain becomes less plastic, less flexible, less able to learn, there's a strong incentive to just hold tightly to what one has accumulated already, and the habits that seem to have worked in the past, at least enough to enable one to live to a biologically old age. So one has little incentive to change. One also has little incentive to change if one doesn't see a long future ahead. So removing those barriers, both the biological senescence and the constraints on one's lifespan, would enable a lot more neuroplasticity, a lot more flexibility in terms of being willing to accept new facts about the world, new insights, new ways of living.
I'm trying to think of a way how to frame this question, because it's very interesting. Why do you think that human beings over time have sort of religiousized the death experience? Why do you think they create religions and talk about afterlives and not focus on problems, or built structures and or sacrifice people to keep other deities and other things like the sun or something, or other, the life force or something, other things alive which would perpetuate life? Why are humans funny like this? Why don't they concentrate on their own biological selves? Is it because of the supply and demand factor? Is it because they have some sort of spiritual? Why do they build pyramids and things like this to say, like kings who are, because I'm just thinking of this because I think it's Gilgamesh, right? That's one of the very first ones, and it's embedded in our human story is embedded in immortality, the immortality quest, and that when you look at history, there's hardly any a point where you get to and they actually concentrate on that goal, except for a few medical advances.
Yes, well, I think one of the reasons is that the scientific method is so new, and previously people had very few tools to actually overcome biological mortality. Even if they led relatively healthy and peaceful lives, there were so many unknowns in the world, so many factors outside of their control. And this is one reason why so many early religions had these capricious deities that needed to be appeased in elaborate special ways, because the only parallels that early humans could draw to these seemingly random and arbitrary phenomena were that they were generated by persons, essentially, because persons could also be capricious and arbitrary. Furthermore, mortality is frightening, and it's frightening to anybody who stops to think about it. And the idea that one's very awareness of the world, even the memory of one's awareness and experience, would cease to be, is, I think, the most frightening thought of them all. So there's a strong impetus to overcome that, but in the face of a lack of actual ways to do so, people were grasping at straws. They were concocting any sort of way that they could potentially justify to themselves that their existence would be perpetuated. And because they saw no way to perpetuate their physical existence, they developed these elaborate stories about an afterlife, about how the physical death is not the end, so it might not matter as much. And that, I think, got a lot of the fear out of their minds. Instead, they could have something to look forward to, such as an afterlife. It's entirely understandable, though tragic, as a coping mechanism, because that's what it was. And for the majority of people throughout human history, there was no technological way out. Their immediate society was not advanced enough to materially expand their lifespans during their lifetimes. Now, if more humans throughout history had focused on technological progress, on building up that infrastructure, then indefinite life extension could have come sooner. Certainly, if we did not have the Dark Ages, if we did not have the wars of religion in the 16th and early 17th centuries, we would be farther along in terms of progress. And I will say I have great admiration for thinkers throughout human history who focused on improvements to secular well-being, even though they knew with a fair amount of certainty that they themselves were mortal. So say the thinkers of the 18th century Age of Enlightenment, many of them did look forward to an era where indefinite life extension could be achieved. Benjamin Franklin wrote about it, the Marquis de Condorcet wrote about it, and yet they knew that they would not live long enough to see it. But still, they laid the foundations and they inspired the subsequent generations who do have a fighting chance.
Benjamin Franklin also wrote that the population doubles every 20 years, which gave Thomas Malthus, his idea. This is going to really round out the end of the show really nicely, because we're coming up to the technological singularity, the event horizons. And for you, I'm quoting you now, but you said that Leonardo da Vinci was the capstone thinker of the agricultural revolution, and that Henry Ford, sort of not the capstone thinker of the industrial revolution, but he was a great thinker of the manufacturing process. And these two people couldn't envision the coming age, the next technological singularity. And we're now in the information revolution, and there's obviously a lot of thinkers, too many to name, who are all jivvying on the same point, so there's no point in even trying or attempting, because we are in the information revolution. But we can't envision the technological singularity coming. I mean, we've talked about the science fiction authors, but so your hypothesis is we can't envision past the event horizons. Explain that.
Yes, indeed. So essentially, the event horizon entails such a dramatic transformation qualitatively of even everyday human life that there are certain technologies, certain modes of living that they make possible that for someone in an earlier paradigm, it's simply not feasible to fully anticipate. So as an example, Leonardo da Vinci had many ingenious designs, essentially designs of helicopters and other types of flying machines. So he could foresee some of the principles that animated the Industrial Revolution, but he would not have been able to foresee, say, the personal computer or electric lighting, for instance. And likewise, I don't think Henry Ford would have been able to foresee chatbots on smartphones, for example, even though a lot of the mass production technology that Ford pioneered is certainly used to develop those more advanced tools. And likewise, there will be ways of combining technologies, and there will be synergies among branches of technological development that we simply have no way to be aware of from our present vantage point. But what I can say is if technology continues to progress, these kinds of synergies and beneficial interactions are going to become more likely. And in the immediate term, there will be transformations of degree. But if they happen for a sufficiently sustained period of time, they will become transformations of kind. Now, this event horizon doesn't necessarily mean that you go to sleep one night and wake up the next day and the world is completely different. From the standpoint of someone living through the transition, it seems fairly continuous, and maybe it will seem rapid, but one could draw a clear connection from here to there. But from somebody 50 or 100 years prior, at the current rate of technological advancement and its acceleration, it would be incredibly difficult to foresee what the world will be like.
It's going to be fascinating as these technologies start to converge and they start to push humanity and in a different direction. It's going to be a wild ride, and hopefully we can all strap ourselves in, and hopefully people such as yourself, the Transhumanist Party, ethicists, thinkers, moralists, they all start coming to this show. Come to this show, rally on this show. We'll talk to you because it's going to be a crazy time, and if we don't get this right, it can go any way. There's a billion ways this could go. But there's a good one and a bad one, and hopefully we can push it onto the good one, because it's going to be interesting to say the least. And I would like to see it go well, because I want to see what's out there in the universe. I mean, if we can get off this planet and we can do it right and we can survive, there's so much to explore. There's a whole universe out there. Once you even conquer the whole solar system, then there's a whole nother solar system. You can go to Alpha Centauri. You can go to Orion's belt, and then you can go to you can do the whole galaxy if you want. And then there's more galaxies, people. Once you go to the galaxy done, you can go to another galaxy and have a look, or we can go interdimensionally. It could be really fun. So and then there's a whole inner universe to explore as well. And there's digital realms that we can explore as well. And they're infinite universes. You can spend your whole life down there doing that. So we got to get this right. There's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I would say this transition during the next several decades is going to be the most crucial time in human history. If we get it right, all of the subsequent eras are going to be much easier than this one. I would say we live in a very challenging time, one of the most challenging eras in human history, though I would say not the most challenging. Probably the threat of nuclear annihilation between circa 1950 to 1970 was even a more perilous time for humankind. But this is a high-stakes era nonetheless. But if we get this right, I think because I've said, all of the major problems facing humankind are already here, we're going to begin making significant dents in those problems. We're going to solve a lot of those problems. And then what remains will be more fascinating and enjoyable. The exploration, the development of the self, the development of sentient life of the human species, and indeed making the universe more hospitable for sentient life.
We'll discover how many alien species are actually out there, because we're still finding things here on Earth. We're still finding new discoveries all the time, and to think that we're the only thing I think is ridiculous. But anyway, Gennady, thank you so much for coming on. I absolutely appreciate it. I have been sleepless nights looking forward to this. It's been fantastic. A huge fan, as you know. It's just so wonderful to actually get to talk to you again. And hopefully we can do this again sometime in the future to update us on what's happening with the party, how the constitutional changes are coming, so you can become president or something. That would be good. If not, a science advisor, or vice president. I don't know what the rules are over there, but you got to do something to change it, because it's gonna be fascinating. So thank you so much for coming on. And Gennady, is there a final statement you'd like to say?
Well, I would encourage everyone watching this show to go to the Transhumanist Party website at transhumanist-party.org and click on the link to register for free membership. It is extremely convenient. It takes less than a minute, and what it will enable you to do is to participate actively in our deliberations and our activities, as well as all of our other ballots. This is the way we build a community that will help humankind transition to the next stage of our civilization. And ultimately, I can be an incorrigible idealist, not in the strict philosophical sense, but in the sense that I believe in hope for humanity. I believe that we can reach a better future, but we can only do that through our own concerted efforts, because progress does not happen automatically. Though we have seen great progress in many areas of our lives, progress is ultimately contingent on human behavior, on what we decide to do. And we are capable of deciding to do the right things, and we are capable of essentially pushing humanity into its next era. So I hope all of you watching this will join us in this effort in whatever manner you're able to contribute, and we look forward to collaborating with you.
Get Zoltan Istvan to bring Andrew Yang onto your team. Maybe he can do it.
Yes, Andrew Yang is an interesting candidate, certainly, and I wish him well in the Democratic primaries. I think the deck is stacked against him, but hopefully he'll be able to bring more attention to technological questions.
He was only given less than 2 minutes talking time on the debate, and he was one of the most searched after the debates, him and Afghanistan war vet. I mean, those two, that's the issues people want. They don't want any more war, and they want to talk about technology and labor displacement. So that's very interesting. Thank you, Gennady. We're going to cut it there. You've been an excellent guest. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gennady. Thank you again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.